Bavaria, 1955. Chalk dust hanging in the afternoon light. Friedrich Wilhelm Raus sets a single photograph on the desk in front of him and says nothing. He lets the class look first. Marines moving through the wreckage of a Pacific island. Smoke still caught in the dead trees. A flag folded into the corner of the frame. To the boys in the room, it is only a picture from a book. To Raus, it is the photograph bound into his own memoir, the one he has read past 100 times without once looking at it the way they are looking at it now. Nobody speaks. A clock somewhere down the hall marks the seconds. Then Dieter Vogel, in the back row, asks the question Raus has been waiting 10 years for someone to ask. Was he ever afraid of them? Raus does not answer. He does not tell the boy yes, and he does not tell him no. He reaches into the drawer of his desk instead, and takes out a notebook he has carried since 1943, its cover soft and dark with handling, and opens it to a page he has never read aloud to anyone. The page he opens to takes him back 13 years, to a desk in Berlin he no longer quite recognizes as his own. 1942. He was 26, newly assigned to intelligence, and certain the way only a young officer can be certain that the war had already taught him everything he needed to know about the men on the other side of it. The British fought well in defense and predictably in attack. The Australians fought hard but alone, trusting instinct over order. The Soviets simply did not stop, a fact the Wehrmacht called inexhaustible, because the honest word, fear, was not permitted in a briefing. And the Americans, newly arrived in numbers, fit the tidiest file of all. Well-equipped amateurs. Generous supply, modern equipment, no seasoning. Men who would perform adequately until the first real shock, then break. The way untested men always broke. It was not an insult. It was arithmetic. In February of 1943, at a mountain pass in Tunisia called Kasserine, the arithmetic appeared to hold. 10,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured in 3 days. Raus remembers reading that report and feeling, for the last time in the war, entirely correct. That certainty lasted less than a year. It ended, quietly, on a memo that should not have reached him at all. A Pacific Theater assessment routed to Berlin from an intelligence officer named Schutter, filed weeks after the Kasserine report, and utterly unlike it. An island called Guadalcanal, a unit called the United States Marine Corps. Schutter had written only a handful of lines, but Raus remembers one of them exactly. This is not common. 4 words, and in the flat, bloodless language of a briefing document, they read like an admission. Attached beneath it, translated from a Japanese interrogation, was a statement from a captured sergeant major named Tachibana, describing Marines who moved through the jungle after dark and left no sound behind them. Our sentries hear nothing, he had said. In the morning we find men dead who had been alive at midnight. Raus read it twice standing at his own desk, then sat down and did something he had never done before with a report that contradicted everything he believed. He picked up his pen and wrote a single line in the margin. Verify through additional sources. This does not correspond to our own observations of American infantry capability. He would spend the next 2 years updating that sentence. A hand goes up near the window, not Dieter this time, a girl with her arms crossed, like she doesn't quite trust the question she's about to ask. What made them different, she says. Raus looks at the photograph a moment longer, and when he answers, he doesn't answer her directly either. He goes back to 1943. To a stack of captured training manuals he had requested against his better judgment, certain he would find nothing in them but propaganda. What he found instead was a doctrine. American doctrine, unmistakably, and yet reading it felt like a distorted reflection of something the Wehrmacht had spent 2 decades perfecting and quietly taking pride in. Auftragstaktik, mission command, the practice of giving a subordinate an objective and trusting him to reach it without waiting for permission at every step. The Germans believed this was theirs. A cultural inheritance, almost a birthright. Raus sat with the American pages in front of him and felt something close to insult. These were the well-equipped amateurs. They were not supposed to have found their way to the same idea a different army had spent generations earning. He had never been trained to respect this enemy. He was beginning to understand he would have to anyway. The report that broke something loose in him came 6 weeks later, and it did not read like the others. Lunga Point, the night of October 24th into the 25th. 3,000 Japanese soldiers against fewer than 300 Marines dug into a thin perimeter, and by every calculation Raus trusted, that perimeter should not have held until dawn. A captured officer named Suzuki gave his account weeks afterward, translated into flat, careful German, stripped of anything that might sound like exaggeration. "We expected Americans to be afraid of dying," Suzuki had said. "They were not. This we did not understand. This was the problem." Rouse read the line 3 times. He thought of the Kasserine file, still sitting in the same cabinet, full of men who had broken exactly the way he'd been taught men broke. These men had not broken. They had called artillery down on their own position rather than be overrun, and then held. He reached for his pen, and this time he did not write a request to verify. He wrote what he actually believed. In 10 words, he would spend the rest of his life trying to take back or explain. "They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead." The file grew after that, and one name in it kept surfacing in accounts that had no reason to agree with each other. A machine gunner, American, on the same stretch of line at Guadalcanal. Rouse never learned to pronounce his name correctly at first. Basilone. But he learned the shape of what the man had done from 3 separate Japanese prisoners, interrogated weeks apart, none aware the others had said anything at all. When the guns to his left were overrun, he crossed open, active fire to repair one that had jammed. When the ammunition ran dry, he ran through the assault to bring more. When his gunners were killed, he worked 2 weapons alone until the attack broke. A corporal named Hayashi told his interrogator, plainly, that they had believed the man could not be killed, and that this was the only way they could explain why he did not stop. Rouse remembers a colleague, Hauptmann Meyer, reading that line and refusing to dismiss it as folklore. "The Japanese are not prone to this kind of attribution," Meyer had written. "If their soldiers describe an enemy as supernatural, something exceptional occurred. We should study this unit more carefully." Rouse did. He was no longer sure what he was studying it for. He stops at the desk for a moment and looks up at the class, and what he tells them next isn't in any file. "I used to think," he says, "that explaining the enemy was the whole of my job. Find the pattern, name it, put it in a box Berlin could use." He doesn't wait for a reaction before he goes on. By 1944, the file was 2 years thick, and a general named Bayerlein, a man who had served as Rommel's own chief of staff, wrote something Rouse still remembers word for word. The Marine Corps represented a separate category, Bayerlein had written. Their junior leadership was aggressive, in a manner frankly surprising given the American civilian tradition. "I do not have a satisfying explanation for this." 4 words from a man who had built his career on having explanations for everything. Rouse remembers reading that line at his own desk and feeling for the first time not frustration but relief, because it meant he wasn't failing at his job. The job itself had been the wrong one all along. He had spent 2 years trying to fit these men into a model. It was beginning to seem, quietly, privately, that the model was the thing that had never fit. The next file to reach his desk carried a number Rouse first assumed was a translation error. Tarawa, November 1943. A Japanese admiral named Shibazaki had reportedly told his staff, with full confidence, that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to take that atoll. He had the fortifications to back the claim. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, a garrison of roughly 4,600 men prepared to die rather than surrender. The Marines took it in 76 hours. Rouse read the after-action report slowly, waiting for the detail that would make it make sense. It never came. The landing craft had hung on the reef, forcing men to wade 400 meters through open water under direct fire. The casualties in the first 2 hours were the worst of the war so far, and the Marines had simply kept going. A colleague, von Mellenthin, wrote the line Rouse would later underline twice. Their losses should have produced a military paralysis. Instead, they produced an acceleration. Rouse sat with that sentence for a long time. He had a phrase now for what he had been circling for 2 years, and he still did not understand it. His hand goes flat on the desk, just for a moment, before he continues. It's a small thing, the kind of gesture a room full of teenagers might not even register. But it is the only outward sign of what the next file cost him. Iwo Jima, February 1945. A Japanese general named Kuribayashi had built his defense underground, miles of tunnels cut into volcanic rock, positions no naval gun could reach, designed not to hold the island but to make its cost unbearable. One of his staff officers, Captain Inoue, survived to be interrogated, and what he said was not about tactics at all. "We planned for American soldiers," he told his interrogators. "We did not plan for men who could watch their friends die and then take another step forward. We did not know this was possible." The flag went up on Suribachi on the 23rd of February. The island was not declared secure until the 26th of March. In the 31 days between the photograph and the actual end, 6,200 more Marines were wounded, and another 1,200 were killed. Rouse stopped trying to explain that file. He started for the first time in 3 years, simply trying to understand it. He opens the notebook fully now, for the first time since the bell rang, and finds the page without looking for it. He reads them the line as he wrote it in 1943. They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead. He lets it sit a moment. Then he turns the notebook slightly, so the light catches a second line, written in different ink, added years later in his own hand. I have thought about this for 12 years, it reads. I believe now that I described it incorrectly. They had not decided they were already dead. They had decided that being dead was acceptable. There is a difference. Rouse does not explain the difference. He does not tell them what it means, or why it took 12 years to find it, or what he thinks it says about the men in the photograph, still open on the desk in front of him. He simply closes the memoir over the picture, the same photograph he set down at the start of the hour, and for a moment his hand rests flat on the cover. The bell rings. Chairs scrape. The class files out, and Dieter Vogel looks back once, but Rouse has already turned toward the window.